Mysteries await just a page away. Ready to dive in? Welcome to The Book Reader, where stories unfold one enchanting page at a time. Subscribe now and unlock the magic.
Richard Branson. Losing My Virginity, the Autobiography. Chapter 1. 28 Victory. March 1992. January 1993. There was £560 million, $1 billion on the table, but I didn't want it. They need to know by 2 p.m. this afternoon, John Thornton told me. I rang off and looked across at Simon and Ken. We had spent the last 20 years building up the company, but nothing had prepared us for selling it. In many ways, the signing of the Rolling Stones was the culmination of everything I had ever wanted to do at Virgin Music. We had been fighting to sign them for 20 years, and now at last we had the greatest rock and roll band in the world on our label. From being a startup label back in 1973 that had relied on the genius of Mike Oldfield, we had now come of age. Now we were the label of choice for many of the world's biggest bands. Artists had seen how we had launched Phil Collins' solo career, and how we promoted UB40 and Simple Minds, what we had been able to do with Culture Club and Peter Gabriel, and they wanted to sign with us. But just as we reached this height, it was over. "Ken?" I asked. "It's your call," he said. "Simon, take the cash. You've got no option." Whenever anyone tells me that I've got no option, I try to prove them wrong. Over the last few days, Thorn EMI's offer had changed from an all-share offer, which would have left me as the largest shareholder in Thorn EMI with 14%, or a lower cash alternative, to a higher cash offer. Even though Thorn had now switched tactics and was offering more cash than shares, I was more attracted to the share exchange, since it would mean that I could keep a stake in Thorn EMI, which I might use in the future as the basis to bid for the company. The difficulty was that everyone told me it would be too risky to use this stake as security to borrow any more money to support Virgin Atlantic. Shares in Thorn EMI were not seen as a cast-iron security. Although I had already drafted a letter to the staff explaining that I was going to take up Thorn EMI shares, and so keep an interest in the company, I reluctantly had to change my mind and go for the cash offer. Before finally agreeing, I called up Peter Gabriel and broke the news to him. I wanted his advice, and I was also aware that the sale would affect his career. "Don't do it, Richard," he said. "You'll wake up one night in a cold sweat and wish that you'd never done it. You'll never get it back again." I knew that he was right. It was exactly what Joan had been saying. But the pressure from BA was too great. By now I felt so sure that Lloyd's was going to foreclose on us that I had no alternative. I was also aware that Simon wanted to sell, and that he wanted to take cash rather than prolong his involvement with the group by taking shares. If taking shares in Thorn EMI would prolong the agony at Virgin Atlantic, then it would defeat the whole point of the exercise. My overriding objective was to save Virgin Atlantic from going under. And cruelly, the only reason I was selling Virgin Music was because it was so successful. If I sold Virgin Music, the Virgin name would be saved. Rather than having one struggling airline and a record company, there would be a secure airline and a secure record company, albeit owned by Thorn EMI. And although I knew that Simon would leave it, I could stay on as president of the company. Most importantly, Ken was going to remain in charge of Virgin within Thorn, and he would safeguard the Virgin reputation. I called up Trevor, who confirmed the bank's line. "Cash is the only choice," he told me. "It means that we can pay back all the debt and start afresh. It'll give you complete freedom. And when thinking about Thorn shares, remember what happened in the stock market crash." That made up my mind. If I took Thorn shares and they fell dramatically in value, I could be powerless to stop the bank moving in. Sir Freddie Laker had reminded me how it happens so fast that it takes your breath away. Rather like Virgin, his airline had fought a long battle against British Airways, and, just when he needed their support, the banks pulled in their loans. He was invited in to see the banks, expecting them to agree to a small increase in his overdraft on the back of an expected boom the following year. But when he arrived, he was shown into a side room. Nobody came to see him for 30 minutes. Finally, he managed to get hold of the bank director, who then invited him up to another room. One look at their faces as he walked in made him realize that something terrible had happened. "We've put Laker Airways into receivership," they told him. It was all over. There was nothing Sir Freddie could do to prevent the receivers from sacking all the staff, changing the locks on the buildings, confiscating all company property, leaving passengers stranded and handing the planes back. The Laker check-in desks at Gatwick vanished overnight, and the sales desk stopped taking bookings. The telephones were unplugged, and a lifetime's work disappeared in 6 hours. It was Sir Freddie's experience which, more than anything else, made me hold back from pushing the banks too far. Once I let them take control, Virgin Atlantic would be finished. It would be scant consolation to know that $1 billion had once been on the table. Obstinate as I am, I recognized that there is a time to back down. Live for the present, I heard my parents' old maxim in the back of my head, and the future will look after itself. My instinct for continued involvement with Virgin Music and taking Thorn EMI shares was tempered by the need for financial security. John Thornton, who was advocating that I should take the shares, did not know the whole picture, nor did Peter Gabriel, who was arguing that I shouldn't do it at all. And so, pushing Virgin Music into the past tense, I picked up the phone and called John Thornton at Goldman Sachs. "I'll take the cash," I heard myself say. "I'll leave the rest to you." "Fine," he said. "The lawyers are on their last round now. I'll call you when it's time to come over." Although I had saved the airline, I felt that I had killed something inside me. Looking at Simon and Ken, I was saddened that we would each go in separate directions. In some ways I was happiest for Ken. He was going to stay with Virgin within EMI, and would soon be releasing records by Janet Jackson and the Rolling Stones. I had no idea what Simon would do, but I suspected that he would enjoy a quieter life. I knew that, as soon as Virgin Music had gone, I would have to come back out of the corner and slug it out with British Airways. I'd already lost count of the rounds we had fought, and was beginning to feel punch-drunk and exhausted. We had to wait before signing contracts, since Fujisankei, our 25% shareholder, had a preemptive clause that allowed them to match any offer for Virgin Music. We also had to decide whether to accept Thorn EMI's offer of £510 million in cash, and taking on Virgin's debts fixed at £50 million, or £500 million in cash, and whatever debts were in the company at the date of completion in 4 weeks' time. Although we had to continue to run Virgin Music in the normal manner, Ken felt sure that by completion the debt would be smaller. "There are some good sales going on at the moment," he said. "Let's take all the money now." And so we opted for £510 million plus £50 million of debt in Virgin Music. In the event Ken was right, and we earned an extra £10 million by choosing this option. In the meantime, we had to wait until 3 a.m. before Fujisankei finally threw in their lot with us, and opted for Thorn EMI's cash. We signed contracts as dawn was breaking. The next morning Thorn EMI announced the purchase of Virgin Music for exactly $1 billion, or £560 million. Simon, Ken and I went to see the staff at our Harrow Road offices. "It's like the death of a parent," Simon said to me as we went inside. "You think that you've prepared for it, but when it happens you realize that you're totally unable to cope." I felt that it was more like the death of a child. Simon, Ken and I had started Virgin from scratch, kept it going through all the times when it looked as if it was coming to an end, and reinvented it with every generation of music, so that it continued to be the most exciting record label in the business. While other record labels such as Apple still symbolized the Beatles and Abbey Road, Virgin had leapfrogged from Mike Oldfield and Gong to the Sex Pistols, then Boy George, then Phil Collins, then Peter Gabriel, then Bryan Ferry, then Janet Jackson and the Rolling Stones. Throughout each era, hippie, punk, new wave, Simon's taste had prevailed and Ken had kept everything together. Ken now stood up and told everyone that they would become part of Thorn EMI, and that he would be staying with EMI to ensure Virgin's independence. Simon started to speak, but instead burst into tears. Everyone looked at me. I stood up, on the verge of tears myself. It was no good. I was in an impossible situation. I couldn't tell them the real reason why their company had been sold. If I told them the truth about the bank's attitude to Virgin Atlantic, then the airline, and the rest of the Virgin companies would be damaged by lack of confidence. Airlines are all built on confidence, and an admission of weakness would scare away passengers. And so, hating myself for appearing to have cashed in, I stood there and offered everyone a job at Virgin Atlantic, if they were unhappy with EMI, and assured everyone that Ken would look after them. When John Webster proposed a vote of thanks to me, Simon and Ken for the best years of our lives, I could bear it no longer. I left the room and set off at a sprint down Ladbroke Grove, tears streaming down my face. Oblivious to the stares of passers-by, I must have run for almost a mile. When I passed a newspaper stand I saw an Evening Standard poster that should have dried the eyes of most grown men. Branson sells for £560 million cash. I ran past it, tears still streaming down my face, and somehow made my way home. Joan was out, so I went into the kitchen and put on the kettle. It was a cold March morning, but the cherry trees at the end of the garden, and in Holland Park, were just beginning to blossom. As I stared outside, a fox broke cover from the hedge and trotted across to the back door, where Joan left out scraps for it. It picked up a chicken carcass, and then turned on its heel, and vanished into the undergrowth. The last photograph I had seen of Lord King had shown him on horseback, resplendent in full hunting gear. Feeling thoroughly depressed, I wrote in my notebook about my decision to go for cash rather than shares. Decided to go for the conservative route for the first time in my life. All my advisors were advocating it, as well as picking up an extra £10 million by choosing the fixed debt option. Ken also gained us another £9 million profit over the currency transfer to Fujisankei. Thorn EMI paid us the £510 million in cash, of which we had to pay £127.5 million to Fujisankei. Fujisankei wanted their money in yen, so we had to change it. We had a month's grace between taking the money and passing it on at completion on June 1st. We had to choose when to switch into yen. Simon and Trevor wanted to do it immediately, so that we all knew where we stood. Ken and I were a little more relaxed and inclined to gamble with it. We kept it in sterling, and as luck would have it, sterling appreciated against the yen. We let it run and changed it at the last moment, earning ourselves a further £9 million profit. Nothing like a bit of luck. And so the crisis was resolved. From the original cash purchase price of £510 million, Fujisankei received £127.5 million, and we received more than £390 million. Simon and Ken took their share of the proceeds and went their separate ways. I used my proceeds to repay the bank and invested the remaining cash in Virgin Atlantic. Rumors about Virgin Atlantic having to pay for fuel in cash were now well and truly scotched. We had more disposable cash than British Airways. The banks immediately started calling me with renewed impatience, no longer to demand their money back, since we had returned their debt to them, but to offer to put my funds in high-interest deposit accounts, offshore accounts, to invest it, to invite me for lunch, to do some kind of business with me, and of course without seeing the irony, offering to lend me as much money as I wanted to finance any future deals. It took a while for me to understand the implications of the sale. For the first time in my life, I had enough money to fulfill my wildest dreams. In the immediate future, I had no time to dwell on this, because that very week the British Airways story took a turn that occupied all my attention. In some ways I was pleased that I didn't have time to think about the sale of Virgin Music. I hate living in the past. I particularly didn't want to think about all the lost friendships. But the weight had been lifted from my shoulders, and at the back of my mind I was aware that the Virgin Group was now free to develop in whichever direction we chose. Virgin Music may have gone. Ken and Simon and I had split up, but the best was yet to come. "Penny," I asked, "please can you give me Freddie Laker's number in Miami?" I dialed the number. "Freddie," I said, "it's Richard here. I've decided to take your advice. I'm suing the bastards." "Go for it," said Freddie. As we embarked on the court case, the single thing that I had to keep reminding myself was that this was a libel case, not an argument over business practices. I had to clear my name. Marshalling the evidence happened in 3 stages. We had all our own evidence which we already knew. We received a vast collection of documents from British Airways under the rules of legal disclosure. And a great deal of evidence began to materialize from disillusioned British Airways staff. It was this evidence that was the most powerful. Out of the blue, Gerard received a call from an ex-BA employee called Sadiq Khalifa, who had worked in the airline industry since 1974, when he was employed by British Caledonian in Tripoli. When British Airways took over BCAL in 1988, Khalifa joined a division within BA called Special Services, which dealt with any special passenger problems. In 1989, he started work as a check-in agent at Gatwick Airport, and then joined the helpline section, which was ostensibly there to meet BA passengers, help them transfer between flights, and look after elderly people. Another more clandestine activity was to try to poach other airlines' passengers. There was an equivalent team at Heathrow nicknamed the Hunters. In April 1990, the helpline team was taken over by sales and reservations, and the new boss, Jeff Day, came into the helpline office and announced to Khalifa and his team of 15 staff that money doesn't come from helping old ladies to the gate. What you have to do is get out and get more passengers from other airlines. Khalifa told Gerard about a second meeting in August which Jeff Day specified had to be a closed meeting. No non-helpline staff could attend or were to hear about it. At this meeting, Jeff Day told Khalifa and his colleagues that Helpline had a new task: to accumulate as much information about Virgin Atlantic as possible. This included flight information, the number of passengers booked on flights, the actual number of passengers who went on board the aircraft, the mix between upper class and economy, and the time of departure. At the end of each shift, the helpliners had to fill out a form on each flight and personally give it to a Mrs. Sutton, who gave it to Day. And how were they to get the information? Jeff Day told the helpliners that they could get it by using the Virgin flight numbers to gain direct access to the British Airways booking system, known in the trade as BABS. This was something they had assured Virgin that they wouldn't do. The locks on the helpline room were changed, and they were to keep the nature of their activities secret. One woman working alongside Khalifa refused to join in these activities since she thought that they were immoral, and the rest of the team covered for her. Gerard took a statement from Khalifa, and we sent it across to British Airways. It was set to become one of the main planks of the court case. Immediately after Khalifa's affidavit arrived with BA's lawyers, I received a call from Michael Davis, a BA non-executive director, who was a long-standing friend of my parents. He asked me whether we could meet for breakfast. At our meeting, Michael began talking about egg on face. This was the first hint of apology. He had obviously been singled out as the one non-executive who could talk to me. Lord King and Sir Colin Marshall were still clearly unwilling to bring themselves down to my level and acknowledge that there was any truth in my accusations. But Michael Davis, as a family friend, had been designated the person who could best finesse the difficult idea that BA might have made some mistakes. "I think the three of us should have a little chat," Michael said. "A little chat? The three of us, you, me, and Sir Colin." "Sir Colin?" "Yes, he's going to be around for the next 10 years, you see. You see, the king is dead. Long live the Marshal. I think it would be a sensible thing to do to meet up, the three of us, and see if anything sensible can come out of it." I watched Michael Davis grope for the appropriate words. Reading between the lines, he was telling me that Lord King's days at British Airways were over. "You see, certain people at British Airways recognize that there's been a certain amount of egg on face," he confessed. "There has been an acceptance of that egg, but if we're going to have a sensible relationship in the future, I think you, me, and Sir Colin should sit down together." As I listened to his tortured syntax and his attempt to offer me a deal, I realized that I was listening to someone talking about somebody else's money and somebody else's livelihood. Michael Davis, Sir Colin Marshall, Robert Ailing, and Lord King would receive their salaries no matter what they had initiated at British Airways. The BA shareholders would stump up money to pay for Brian Basham, to pay for the detectives, and to pay for their lawyers when I sued them. Perhaps it was a good investment. If they had managed to put Virgin Atlantic out of business, it would have been money very well spent. But Virgin Atlantic was primarily my own company. It was a private company, and if BA poached an upper-class passenger to New York, that was £3,000 that Virgin would lose. £3,000 that we couldn't reinvest in the business. And unlike BA, I had no vast corporate reserves I could draw on to fund salaries. So for all his talk of egg on face, Michael Davis was missing the point. BA had tried very hard to put me out of business and my staff out of their jobs. They had also forced me to sell Virgin Music, which had affected a whole group of other people who had nothing to do with the airline. It made me furious. I was not going to sit back over a gentleman's breakfast and agree that it was all just a certain amount of egg on face. Throughout the entire Dirty Tricks episode, one had been accused of being naive. Naive to believe that British Airways could behave in such a manner. Naive to think that British Airways would ever stop behaving in such a manner. Naive to believe that I would ever be able to bring British Airways to court. Naive to think for a moment that I could win a court case. The word naive echoed round and round in my head, and at some points had almost undermined my resolve to go on. Sir Michael Angus told Sir Colin Southgate that I was naive to take on British Airways, as if it was a boy's own story. Jeannie Davis told my parents that Ricky should learn to take the rough with the smooth. And even people like Sir John Egan of the BA told me not to shake the money tree. Perhaps I was naive in fighting for the justice I wanted. Perhaps it was idealism. Or perhaps I was just plain stubborn. But I knew that British Airways activities were unlawful, and I wanted compensation. I was determined to make all those people, who had dismissed my stance as naive, eat their words. I called Gerard Tyrrell after the breakfast, and told him how sympathetic and persuasive Michael Davis had been. Rubbish, he retorted. BA had the chance to settle at the beginning, but they didn't. It's only because their lawyers are now looking into a black hole of guilt that they're being forced to consider settling. I had never heard Gerard sound so angry. You'll never have a better opportunity than now to nail them, he went on. Don't cave in now. Just testing you, I said. Of course I won't cave in. The next week we met George Carman, our formidable QC who was preparing our case. With his white hair and impeccable manners, George seemed like everyone's favorite uncle outside the courts. Inside, he had the subtlety, tenacity, and killer instinct of a praying mantis. People went to extraordinary lengths to avoid him. What do you think of my opening line of address? George asked us. The world's favorite airline has a favorite pastime. It's called shredding documents which are liable to be misconstrued. I called Michael Davis and told him that I couldn't agree to let my accusations slip under the carpet. The court case was set to start in January, and the British Airways directors would be cross-examined by George Carman. I didn't even need to hint at how much George Carman would relish this. Sobered by this prospect, Michael Davis put down the phone. By now I felt really confident that we could beat BA. Not only had we discovered so much about their dirty tricks, we had also found out details of an extraordinary BA undercover operation. Someone contacted my office to say that he had some information about an undercover operation set up by BA involving various private detectives. He said that he had a computer disk containing a diary of everything the private detectives had done. He insisted that I meet him personally before he handed over the disk. I felt rather strange as I climbed into the car with one of my assistants, Julia Madonna. This was partly due to the fact that I was wearing a microphone hidden in my crotch area, so that I could tape my conversation with the contact. I knew how vital the tape of Brian Basham's meeting with Chris Hutchins had been, and I wasn't going to leave anything to chance with this meeting. When I set up Virgin Atlantic, I had no idea that I would have to resort to James Bond-style activities in order to run it. I scribbled in my notebook as our contact talked. Trying to find out what we were up to didn't want to give that impression. Not at Lord King's level. Being careful not to be seen to do any investigation, only putting up defenses. Most importantly, our contact gave us the computer disk. When I had it printed out, it was a revelation. The private detectives had kept an extremely detailed log of what they had been up to and who they had been reporting to at British Airways. The log revealed that the operation had been codenamed Covent Garden. The first entry, dated November 30th, 1991, stated, "First sight of Project Barbara report seen in S1's office in Insearch House." S1 turned out to be the codename for David Burnside, and Project Barbara was the report on Virgin that Basham had given to Chris Hutchins. Most of BA's top management had been named, but they had been given alphanumeric references, so that their real names never appeared in print. I found it relatively easy to establish who was who. Lord King was LK or C1. Colin Marshall was C2, and Basham was S2. There were others, R1 and R2, who were unknown to us. They turned out to be the private detectives, Nick Del Rosso and Tom Crowley, who were leading the team under the guise of trying to find the mole inside BA, who was leaking information to us. Operation Covent Garden was supposedly run by Ian Johnson Associates, international security management consultants. The log detailed how Johnson and Del Rosso briefed BA's director of security, David Hyde, and the legal director, Mervyn Walker, on the progress of Operation Covent Garden. It also recorded meetings with Robert Ailing and Colin Marshall. The log contained astonishing details of how the team of detectives had convinced some of BA's senior management that we were running an undercover operation against BA. The amount of money they estimated we were spending on our non-existent operation was £400,000. We later found out that BA was spending £15,000 a week on Covent Garden. The sheer absurdity of the operation was revealed by details of how the detectives had staked out the Tickled Trout Hotel in Lancashire with secret cameras and sound recording equipment. The idea was to secretly record a meeting between Burnside and an agent that the Covent Garden team had convinced themselves was working for Virgin. The log recorded how their plans came unstuck when Burnside failed to turn on his bugging device. I could have spared BA the trouble. I never have employed private detectives and never will. That is not how I or Virgin operate. When I had finished reading the Covent Garden log, I felt as if I had returned from a parallel universe, one created in the imaginations of BA's hired conspiracists and senior management at the cost of thousands of pounds. I really began to look forward to the libel case, which was being heralded as the mother of all libel trials. December 7, 1992. BA have collapsed, George Carman told me. They have today paid just under £500,000, £485,000 to be precise, into court. They've admitted in effect that they're entirely guilty as charged. We later discovered that, just before the court case was due to start, BA's lawyers had told them that they had no hope of winning. If they wanted to avoid the humiliation of having to stand in the witness box and be cross-examined by George Carman, and seeing all their activities written up in the press, then their only option was to make a payment into the court and start negotiating an out-of-court settlement. At first I was in two minds over whether to accept the money. I was innocent, and we could put all the BA directors in the witness box and destroy them. But then as we talked about it, I realized that, although this was tempting, such a move could be seen to be vindictive and was highly risky. You've got to remember why you brought this case, George Carman advised me. You wanted the dirty tricks to stop, and you wanted to clear your name. BA have admitted that you are totally right. You've cleared your name. If you persist with the case, then two things may go wrong. The jury might award you damages, but they might think that you were such a rich man that you didn't need £500,000 and just award you £250,000. That would be seen as a failure for you and a triumph for British Airways. If the jury award you less than British Airways have paid into court, then you will have to pay both sets of costs. So you may win the case, but lose a lot of money, and people will be confused as to why Virgin Atlantic has to pay £3 million of costs. This last part of George's advice was very persuasive. Although in some ways my decision to settle out of court could be something of an anticlimax, in that we wouldn't have the satisfaction of watching George Carman cross-examining the directors. By deciding to accept BA's offer, we won a completely clear-cut victory with no risks attached. We're immediately free to get on and run the business. What do we have to do now then? I asked. We have 21 days in which to take the money out of court, if we're going to accept it. So we'll do that. Good Lord, no, George said, looking shocked. I'm not going to accept it. I'm going to get them to give us at least £600,000. If they've given £485,000, they can go up to £600,000. Every £100,000 makes an inch bigger headline. George spent a week negotiating over the payment. On December 11, 1992, we agreed the terms of the highest uncontested libel payment ever made in British legal history. £500,000 to me personally to compensate for the personal libel, and £110,000 to Virgin Atlantic to compensate for the corporate libel. January 11, 1993. Virgin screws BA was the Sun's headline. There wasn't much room for anything else on the front page. I'd have preferred it the other way round, Kelvin Mackenzie, the Sun's editor, told me. It would have made a better headline. I was in George Carman's chambers with Gerard Tyrrell and my father, whom I was delighted to share in the triumph. We walked round to the High Court in the Strand, and jostled our way through the mass of photographers outside. The corridor outside Court 11, where the hearing would take place, was teeming. Inside the court it was very quiet. British Airways were noticeable by their absence. Lord King, Sir Colin Marshall and Robert Ailing, the three main protagonists, weren't there. David Burnside was absent. Brian Basham had gone abroad, but his lawyers were there making a last-ditch attempt to have his name removed from the statement of apology. The judge listened to the plea, and then asked British Airways counsel their opinion. They agreed with Virgin that Brian Basham's name should be included in the apology. The judge ruled that the apology should stand as prepared. George Carman stood up and read the agreed statement. When he came towards the end, there was complete silence in court. British Airways and Lord King now accept unreservedly that the allegations which they made against the good faith and integrity of Richard Branson and Virgin Atlantic are wholly untrue. They further accept that Richard Branson and Virgin had reasonable grounds for serious concerns about the activities of a number of British Airways employees, and of Mr. Basham, and their potential effect on the business interests and reputation of Virgin Atlantic and Richard Branson. In these circumstances, British Airways and Lord King are here now by leading counsel to apologize, and to make very substantial payments to the plaintiffs, by way of compensation for the damages and distress caused by their false allegations. They also seek to withdraw their counterclaim against Virgin Atlantic and Richard Branson. In addition, British Airways and Lord King have agreed to pay Richard Branson and Virgin Atlantic's legal costs in respect of the claim and the counterclaim, and have undertaken not to repeat the defamatory allegations, which are the substance of this action. George Carman paused and took a breath. The court held its breath. British Airways and Lord King are to pay Richard Branson £500,000 damages, and are to pay Virgin Atlantic £110,000 damages. George had to raise his voice to make himself heard above the sudden noise in the court. In the light of the unqualified nature of the apology, and the payment of a very substantial sum by way of damages, Richard Branson and Virgin Atlantic consider that their reputation is publicly vindicated by agreeing to settle the action on those terms. I saw tears running down my father's cheeks as he listened to the settlement. He had a large silk handkerchief in his breast pocket, and he took it out to wipe his eyes. I clenched my fists under the table to stop myself from jumping to my feet. The single jarring note was in the British Airways apology when, although they apologized unreservedly, they then went on to absolve themselves of any blame. The investigation which British Airways carried out during the course of this litigation revealed a number of incidents involving their employees, which British Airways accept were regrettable, and gave Richard Branson and Virgin Atlantic reasonable grounds for concern. I should, however, like to emphasize, their counsel said, that the directors of British Airways were not party to any concerted campaign against Richard Branson and Virgin Atlantic. A number of people in the court snorted with derision. It had been the one phrase that British Airways had refused to take out of the apology. Let them leave it in, George Carman had finally advised me. People will see exactly what it really means. We haven't heard the last of that word concerted. Then, with the judge's permission, Basham's counsel stood up to point out that his client did not accept that the references to him in the foregoing statement were an accurate summary of his actions on behalf of BA. Outside, in the mad hustle of journalists and photographers, I held up both hands and shook my fists in triumph. I accept this award not only for Virgin, I said, but also for all the other airlines. For Laker, for Dan Air, Air Europe and BCAL. They went under and we survived British Airways, but only just. Back at Holland Park the party started. I decided to share the £500,000 damages, which had been given to me among all the Virgin Atlantic staff, since they had all had to suffer from the pressure which British Airways had put us under, in the form of reduced salaries and cuts in their bonuses. The television was on in the corner and every news program covered the Virgin success as the main story of the day. ITN even interviewed Sadiq Khalifa and Yvonne Parsons. The party stopped to cheer them momentarily, and then went on. Much later, I was in the middle of talking to someone when a wave of exhaustion hit me. I realized that we had won. All the stress relaxed out of my shoulders. I smiled a wide, happy, contented smile, toppled sideways and fell deeply asleep.
And that marks the end of the current chapter. Thank you for listening to The Book Reader. Stay tuned for the next episode tomorrow. Please subscribe for updates.